Hi, I'm Kristen Greenwood, Assistant Curator of Education at the Birmingham Museum of Art. Welcome to Art Break. This is our weekly series where we invite guests from a variety of disciplines to come and talk about different topics each week. This week's speaker is Gail Andrews, Executive Director of the museum. And Gail is going to be talking about the exhibition Celebrate Life, the art of Chris Clark, which is especially meaningful to us as Chris was a great friend to the museum. He's worked with a lot of us in the education department, and we just have a long history with him. He passed away a few months ago, so we're thrilled to have the exhibition here. And it runs through March.
Well, welcome everybody. How many people knew Chris?
Just from here.
Yeah, okay, well, good. We get to introduce him to a whole new group of people. Joanne was just saying beforehand, I don't know anything about him, but I've heard good things about this exhibition. Chris was a Birmingham resident, grew up in Inslee, about a 5-minute drive away, and many of the works of art we're going to see reflect that Inslee neighborhood growing up. But I'll give you just a little bit of background. And I'll also say this exhibition, Celebrate Life, is really a response to Chris's death just in August. He was only 53, died from the complications of diabetes, and Chris was such a great friend of this museum, and I'll talk about that in terms of the teaching he did in our studio programs with adults and children, but primarily children. He had a real special touch and connection with youth, as well as the works of art of his that we collected over the years. And not all of these belong to the museum, but a few do, and I can point those out, but many from friends of the museum who are generous to lend to us. And his death was unexpected, though he had suffered from diabetes for quite a while. But he'd just been to an art break in July, I think, where 2 of his quilts were up, and he seemed in such great health. It was just a shock to all of us, and we thought, well, this was a great time to just do a tribute. So certainly not a retrospective, but I think gives a really good overview of the art he made over the 20-plus years that he was creating pieces. So as I said, Chris was born and grew up in Inslee. He went to Livingston University for about 3 years and decided 3 years into his work that if he was going to be, he just wasn't spending enough time being a serious student. And he was having a great time partying, but maybe he better give up his dreams of being a teacher right now and do something different with his life and come back to college when he was really ready to study. He joined the Army, and he spent 7 years in the Army with about 4 years in Frankfurt, Germany. Got to see a lot of Europe. Came back to the Birmingham area in 1988 and got a job in a masonry factory, which then went out of business, and then he got another factory job, which also went out of business. And by 1990, he found himself unemployed and in very bad health. And he didn't know what was wrong with him, but he felt terrible. And the main thing he noticed was that his vision was going. And he had a really, I thought, beautiful description of this loss of vision, where he said, I just felt like clouds were coming in front of my eyes, and they'd go and they'd come, and mainly it was getting very gray. And so he was very concerned about that, and he thought, I've always wanted to draw and paint, and I better do it, because I'm losing my sight. I'm going to be blind, or I may be dying. So he was living with his grandmother at that point in Inslee, and she was a quilter, and she would be working, quilting. He would take just pieces of board, scrap lumber, scrap board he found, and he was painting. And he was primarily painting scenes of daily life, people washing, people fishing, just kind of everyday tasks. But he kept watching his grandmother quilt, who was a great mentor, support to him, and he asked her if she'd teach him how to quilt, and she did, and first made a very small quilt, and the first thing he did was paint it. And he said, I hadn't intended to, but when I saw it, I just loved the way it looked. And his grandmother said, why'd you do that? You can put it in the washing machine and all the paint's going to come off. And he said, it's not to use, it's to put on the wall. And so he kept painting quilts, and people didn't like them. Nobody responded well. And he was going to the flea market at that point, selling his scraps of wood. And one woman who was buying some of his paintings on panel said to him, do you ever paint on canvas? And he said, no, but I do. I've done these quilts. And she said, well, could I see them? And so she bought 2 right off the bat and encouraged him to do that. So the earliest quilt we have in this show is 1992. that he was painting. So I'd say between 91 to 92 was where he was really experimenting with painting on fabric, and then became very serious from then on. And this was before he was painting furniture or making the staffs. And his earliest pieces were all religious themes, and I think he was becoming much more spiritual in his own reflection at that point. His grandmother was a very religious woman, and I think that was an inspiration as well. But he was looking much more inwardly. He was reading the Bible. He was going to church, and so many of his pieces Sermon on the Mount, you'll see loaves and fishes over there, taking biblical stories and depicting those, but also painting the interiors of churches. And there's some great quilts. We don't have one in this show, but they really have big scenes of church interiors as well. And then he branched off from that and started painting his Inslee neighborhood. So he kept on with scripture, and you'll see those throughout his career, but he started painting children. He started painting his memories. And we call Chris a folk artist, and that's a term that over the last 20 years everyone keeps questioning. Now you can just move closer to the quilt, just because Nick is filming, don't worry. Just come in, because you need to look. You can just keep looking around while I'm talking. I don't mind if you wander off from me, and please interrupt me anytime if you have a question or have a comment. We use the term folk artist to describe Chris, and really any academically untrained or self-taught artist. But it's a phrase or a definition that has been worked and questioned and rethought and reconsidered, particularly over the last 20 years, I would say, with this second wave of enthusiasm over untrained or self-taught artists. They've been called visionaries. So I'm just blanking on the outsider art. What were you going to say? Outsiders, primitive, all these different definitions. And I have come back to folk, not only because it's sort of the more popular term of the people, by the people, for the people, but we also know what we're talking about. I found it to be the most descriptive in so many ways. Art brut is another, but that doesn't really, there's so many descriptions. But folk, in this case, I really mean somebody who has been untrained, is painting very much from an internal motivation and spirit. And I think Chris's absolutely comes in that, where he wanted to express himself and he felt he was losing his sight. And often with artists in this category, there's often a tragedy or a calamity or a dramatic personal situation that motivates them to paint. It may be the loss of a loved one, a disease, death, etc., traumatic accident that moves them to paint. And in Chris's, of course, it was the fear that he was losing his eyesight. I should add that around that time his grandmother did take him to the doctor. He was diagnosed with severe diabetes, put him on medication, and his sight gradually restored. It took a while, but it gradually came back to him. But about this time, 92, he started looking around his neighborhood and painting children, games, neighborhood scenes he saw in his Inslee neighborhood, but also his own youthful memories. So here we have Inslee, sort of many buildings moved together. His school, a church, neighborhood church, I think it's his church. Everything from children playing in the summer in the fire hydrant to the ice cream or sweets man coming and serving up treats, jump rope, the fall leaves, the trees. And he said, when I started painting children, I became so much happier. And he said, I was feeling sort of sad with some of my early quilts, but these memories and looking out his own window, depicting the joy of life that he saw around him, really brought him a lot of happiness as well. And so you'll see a number of these around town. Daycare centers. My children's pediatrician's office was filled with the work of Chris Clark, so you'll see them a lot of places. Also Inslee, and this is a really rare depiction that I'm so glad we have in this exhibition. As I said, you'll see a lot of biblical scenes, and you'll see a lot of children's games and stories. So I think this particular one is one of the finest ones I've seen, especially with this piece border. This where he has individually seamed these pieces of fabric together to make a second border is very unusual in his work, and it's great to have. This quilt is Function in the Junction, is Tuxedo Junction. And we all know the Erskine Hawkins song, Tuxedo Junction. And Tuxedo Junction was the place where the two streetcars met at Tuxedo Park in Inslee. And from the 1920s to the 1940s, it was the social center of African American life. Clubs, cafes, stores, it was just a lively social spot. And this quilt depicts one of those clubs with the Erskine Hawkins band, singer, piano, people dancing, people having a great time, the addition of glitter, paint. I mean, you just feel this kind of high life, nightlife that's going on. And when I first saw this quilt in a local collection, I just thought it was a jazz club, you know. But one of our education staff members remembered, Chris, as I mentioned, was a great teacher. And he did a lot of workshops with children, he did a lot of studio work, he traveled to schools, he did many things, but he was also an active participant in our summer mural program. And I think at this point, the museum over the last 20+ years has painted about has painted close to 70 murals in public areas throughout Birmingham. And one of them was at Tuxedo Junction. And here's Chris, and you can come over in a minute and look at this. Here's Chris painting this, and on each of these bandstands, which is this, or these music stands, has the EH for Erskine Hawkins. And so it's like, it is, you know, this is Erskine Hawkins at Tuxedo Junction. So it's a great, happy memory from that point that really depicts a very active part of his neighborhood as well. This particular piece, Abraham, Father of the Chosen People, was a special commission from actually one of our Board of Trustees and a docent as well, Jim Sokol, who asked Chris to do something from the Old Testament. And Chris really studied the Bible, worked with his minister, and painted what I think is just a beautiful quilt with the Beatitudes that you see here. And again, lots of individual work where he's worked on each square and then put them together in almost like books. You know, you can almost imagine various books of the Bible, the way he's assembled it. Go ahead.
Do you know if he hand-stitched these or machine-stitched?
Machine-stitched. Yeah. I think everything was on machine, yes. Even the quilted surface was on machine. Of course, he'd assemble the quilt first and then paint it. He was nervous about how much paint he was using because fabric, as you know, soaks up paint, and he really didn't want to keep spending so much money on paint. And so he experimented and developed a combination of fabric dye, polyurethane, and I guess fabric dye, paint, and then would cover the surface with a polyurethane coating that would help it, you know, keep it more on the surface and not the fabric soak it up so much. Because, well, let's look at this general area, and then I'll talk about this piece before we move to a couple of other quilts. As I talked about, Chris started by painting on these scraps of wood, but he would continue to pick up different things, salvaged pieces of wood, salvaged stuff, it's pieces of furniture, either from a thrift market or you know, junk store, whatever it might be. And so there are a lot of pieces of painted furniture that Chris started doing, where he would just take his scenes that he was doing and transfer them to furniture. In 1995, we did an exhibition called African Staffs. And it was one of the first times I think Chris became really interested in African art and motifs and symbolism. And he was teaching, he was helping primarily children make staffs in relationship to the exhibition. And you'll see African fabric, there's some kente cloth, cowrie shells, a number of pieces that he's incorporated on this staff, and using really the colors of you know, bright, vivid, bold colors that's apparent in so much African fabric especially. And as I said, became very interested in African art, and I think you can tell this piece and this piece, a number of pieces that he really has been influenced. He also loved buttons, and you can see them here throughout this staff. You'll see them on a number of the other pieces, and you see them really on the wastebasket in the center. This is the most recent piece in this exhibition, and it was a tribute to our first African-American president. And so, and it's of course a tribute to Barack Obama and his family, but it also uses his message of hope through the campaign in 2008. So it's called the Yes We Can. And here's Barack Obama giving his State of the Union, buttons, buttons, buttons that finally end in this beautiful Washington monument that is just assembled entirely of white buttons. And it goes around with him being tutored by his mother to finally the family, Michelle, the girls with Barack Obama at the, you know, symbolizing inauguration and election, which I think is such a clever, fun thing. Chris loved furniture. He loved chairs especially. And he painted furniture, but he also assembled furniture. So here's the spoon chair that he made. I think this dates from 07, 08. Let me look at this, when this was made. Oh, 2001, sorry. 2001. So here he had a frame of a chair, but then he's taken it and he's covered it with a turkey roasting pan and a tray and lots of spoons, a candy dish. There's a colander that he has totally disassembled and created these kind of wings on the legs. So a real imaginative use of materials, you know, and that's one of the things I think with so many of the folk artists we see, they're trained artists too, but sometimes either we're looking for it more or maybe it happens more with an untrained artist where they really are not just see things that we don't always see in everyday materials, but they make use of those materials in ways that we wouldn't think about. So I think of Charlie Lucas, how he takes railroad spikes and fashions them into camels. I think of Lonnie Holly, who will take, you know, wire and butter pats and fashion it into a beautiful profile of a woman with a turban. And here is Chris, who's taken a colander and has made these really wonderful embellishments on these chair legs. I mean, it could be like a reinterpretation of a Chippendale chair. And just clever, creative, and I think looking around, you'll see so many unusual additions to his three-dimensional objects. This guitar, we call it an electric guitar, of course, from about 2000 with a switch pad down here. But here is a two paint brushes that have been broken up to make wings for the bird, the tines of a fork that are fashioned as little comb, you know, wire used in different ways. Again, buttons, creating this really elaborate headdress on this particular staff. So clever, unusual. The painting over there where he's, you know, flattened out pop cans and created the figure against, you know, on that small wooden panel. One of my favorite quilts in the exhibition is this piece, Jesus Walking on Water. The alternative reading of this is Jesus stepping on a blue dress. And this symbolizes President Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky, the dress that came to symbolize that unfortunate affair, unfortunate chapter of our history. But Chris's in conversation, he'd say, the message is that Jesus can redeem any situation. But this one, I mean, the elaboration, again, you know, the kente cloth, the beautiful African fabrics he's incorporated, incorporation of this just wild sequined fabric, all the Mardi Gras beads, the layers of borders that radiate out from the central figure, I think are just so beautifully done. I just think it's you know, visually just a knockout. It's a beautiful quilt. This, you'll notice that his faces are rarely filled in. And when we get to the church ladies over there, you'll see that he has done their faces. But on the other quilts, you'll see there are no faces. And Chris said he really didn't like putting expression because it can overly influence the viewer. You know, you automatically attribute an emotion or a reaction, a thought to the figure rather than just letting it bring your own. This may also be because he's depicting Jesus, and even though this is a really large piece, he didn't want to manifest features at all. In the corner, we have the church ladies, the hat ladies. He called these church ladies. And the first piece, this is one of the, I think it is the very first church lady that he did in 1994, and it was really a tribute for his grandmother. And I've talked to you about how much his grandmother was a mentor and friend, and lived with her and was very, very close to her, and spent a lot of time with her growing as he grew up in Inslee as well. So here's the neighborhood, you know, more simple patchwork, beautiful dress, very simple hat. We've seen books and photographs that have documented the hat ladies of African American churches over the past. There have been many projects that have done that now, but these really gorgeous, flamboyant hats. And here's a very simple hat that he's placed on his grandmother with this feather that's just always is, wafting in the breeze, to this one that was done about 10 years later, where his hats have become much more three-dimensional, much more decorated, you know, more jewelry, but these hats that have really come out from a two-dimensional plane, and she just looks so, so elegant.
And the fan.
The fan. Isn't the fan? I know. I started to mention that, and sort of picks up this little angel motif and star motif, stars, and you know, I know it's really, it's so great the way he did that as well. But just as I said, very, very creative with the use of materials. Another influence, I should say, or he loved music, and something else that he depicted a lot were musicians. And we see the guitarist over there, but we have a pianist, we have all sorts of musicians that he's done in quilt form. And he did a series of quilts on the Blind Boys of Alabama. And they used it for the Blind Boys of Alabama used one of the pieces that he did for their cover of one of their CDs. It was a CD for which they were nominated for a Grammy. So it was great for Chris to be able to see that as well.
It was down in New Orleans, and they actually had it hanging in Tipitina's when they performed.
Did they really?
You can see it in the DVD.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. Terrific. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Well, I'd love to answer questions about anything or comments, any questions or comments you have about Chris? Yes?
We were here in July for the Artbreak, and he came, and the reason he came was because of you.
Well, and his quilts. I mean, I loved Chris, and it just, that's so sweet, thank you. And we had 2 of his quilts up. It was, that's what was just so shocking, because he had lost weight and he was doing so much better. And it was a great art break. We had quilts up from Chris and from Nori Zell and from Yvonne Wells, several of the Freedom Quilters, and some unidentified makers as well. And Chris came, and of course we weren't recording the talk that day, as it always happens, and Chris spoke about his quilts, and Yvonne Wells' great-granddaughter and great-great-granddaughter were here and talked about her, so it really was great. And it was
because of the book.
Yes.
Forward you have written.
Well,
I think that
well. That's so nice. Thank you. Thank you. And
question, were his works exhibited in other museums?
thank you, Nancy. I meant to say that, and I forgot. He, for Chris, the biggest honor he had was at the Anacostia Museum at the Smithsonian, did an exhibition of his work in 2005. And so it was a 3-man show, and Chris's quilts and some of his furniture, or staffs, quilts and staffs, were exhibited at that point, yes. And he has been in museums in the state, I don't think outside of Alabama other than the Smithsonian, which he was so excited about. It was great, as he should be, as any artist would be. Lots of collectors. He exhibited at Magic City and at Bluff Park, at Kentuck, and so he had a lot of collectors in the state of Alabama. Yeah. Who have lent to this. Joanne asked what belongs to us. The loaves and fishes belongs to us. One of the staffs belongs to us. There are some promised gifts from collectors, which will be the two Hat Ladies and the Abraham and the Erskine Hawkins, which is wonderful. And we will make requests for other pieces along the way as well, because I want to make sure we have a good representation of Chris. The chairs do not belong to us right now, no. But I think there's potential. Which is great about doing these exhibitions, because you get to see what people have in their collections, and often they're more than happy to make a promised gift of something, you know. And many of these are lent by supporters of the museum. Other questions or comments? Well, I just thank you all for coming so much. And this will be up through early March, and I think it's through March 4th. And the Education Department has done a very nice interpretive station at the end of the hall by the Bierstadt, where you can go in and learn more about Chris's work, and an opportunity for people to make things based on his art. Good, thank you guys for coming.